There is a place in this country so hostile to human life that the United States government once used it to simulate conditions on the surface of other planets. A place where the ground temperature has been recorded at 201 degrees Fahrenheit, where the air itself seems to press down on you like something alive and angry, where explorers have walked into the basin and simply never come back, their bodies found days later with no clear cause of death, no injury, no illness, just a stillness that the desert seemed to have decided was permanent. Death Valley did not get that name by accident. And yet, in the summer of 1947, a small group of men descended into that valley and found something beneath its cracked and ancient floor that, according to the people who were there, rewrote everything we thought we knew about who had lived on this continent before us. They found tunnels. Not natural cave formations carved by water or wind. Tunnels. Constructed. Deliberate. Running deep beneath the desert floor in directions that seemed to follow some kind of plan or grid. And then, just as quickly as that story emerged, it was buried. Covered over. Sealed away. The men who had been there were quietly discouraged from talking. The location was never officially identified. And the academic world that should have been buzzing with questions instead went almost completely silent. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. Death Valley sits at the edge of the Mojave Desert in eastern California, pressed against the Nevada border like something the continent wanted to forget about. It is the lowest point in North America, sitting 282 feet below sea level at its deepest depression. The basin stretches roughly 130 miles from north to south and is flanked by two mountain ranges that trap heat the way cupped hands trap water. The Panamint Range rises to the west. The Amargosa Range climbs to the east. Between them, the valley floor bakes under a sun that feels closer there than anywhere else in the country. The valley is not simply hot. It is a system designed to concentrate heat in ways that defy easy comprehension. The surrounding mountains prevent cooling air from moving through. The salt flats at the valley floor absorb heat during the day and release it slowly at night, ensuring that even after sunset the air remains thick with warmth. The rock formations along the valley walls have been measured radiating stored heat long after dark, turning the basin into something close to an oven that never fully cools between bakings. And yet people have lived here. That fact surprises most people who encounter it for the first time. We are conditioned to think of Death Valley as uninhabitable, as the kind of place that sits outside the range of human settlement. But that assumption is wrong, and it has always been wrong. The Timbisha Shoshone people have lived in and around Death Valley for at least 1,000 years by most conservative estimates, and many researchers believe their presence there, or the presence of their ancestors, goes back considerably further. They know the valley not as a death trap, but as a landscape of resources, of specific plants and animals and water sources, of routes through the mountains and down into the basin floor that require knowledge built over generations. The Timbisha relationship with Death Valley is one of the quieter and more remarkable stories in American history. They survived not by avoiding the extreme conditions, but by building a complete understanding of them. They knew which springs ran through summer and which ones dried up. They knew the elevation zones where certain plants grew, when those plants produced food, how to process them, how to store them. They followed seasonal patterns that moved them through the valley and up into the mountains as temperatures shifted across the year. Their word for the valley, Tumpisa, refers to the ochre-colored rock found in certain formations there. They did not name it for death. They named it for the color of the earth. Before the Timbisha, before even the cultures that the Timbisha themselves might have descended from or learned from, the valley and the surrounding desert region were home to people we know almost nothing about. The archaeological record of the Mojave and the Great Basin is fragmentary in ways that should embarrass modern scholarship. We have found tools, petroglyphs, fire rings, scattered deposits of worked stone. We have carbon dated some of these materials and come back with numbers that push the human timeline in the American Southwest back further and further with each decade of serious excavation. but we do not have anything close to a complete picture of who was here, in what numbers, with what degree of cultural complexity, and for how long. That gap in the record is not entirely the result of the desert destroying evidence. Organic material does not survive well in environments of extreme heat and dryness, it is true, but stone survives. Carved rock survives. Tunnel walls, if they were ever cut, would survive. The absence of a complete record is not purely natural. Some of it is a product of decisions made by institutions and individuals who decided, at various points in American history, that certain kinds of evidence were inconvenient. In 1947, a man named Howard E. Hill gave a lecture before the Los Angeles Chamber of Commerce. This was not a fringe gathering. The Los Angeles Chamber of Commerce in 1947 was a serious civic organization, attended by businessmen, community leaders, professionals. The lecture Hill gave that day described what he said was a series of remarkable discoveries made in the area of Death Valley, discoveries that he attributed to a man named Dr. F. Bruce Russell, an amateur archaeologist who had reportedly been exploring the region for several years. According to Hill's account, Russell had initially stumbled upon the entrance to underground passages while working in the area, sometime in the mid-1940s. Russell was not a trained archaeologist in the academic sense. His background was in medicine, but he had developed a serious interest in the pre-Columbian history of the American Southwest and had been spending considerable time in the Death Valley region, exploring its geology, its rock formations, its dried lake beds and ancient shorelines. What Russell described, and what Hill relayed to that audience in Los Angeles, was the discovery of a network of tunnels beneath the valley floor, not shallow depressions or natural caves, but deep, constructed passages with what appeared to be worked walls, smooth floors, and in certain sections, chambers that opened off the main corridors. Russell claimed to have explored sections of these tunnels personally, and to have found within them artifacts that he believed were remnants of a civilization predating anything in the standard archaeological record for North America. The audience at that Chamber of Commerce lecture did not laugh Hill off the stage. That is worth noting. The response, at least as it was recorded in the local newspapers that covered the event, was one of genuine interest. Questions were asked. Plans were discussed to organize a more formal expedition. Hill spoke about Russell's ongoing work in the area and suggested that a more complete excavation, properly funded and properly staffed, could yield results that would change the way American history was taught in every school in the country. And then, with a speed that still seems strange when you examine the timeline, the story went quiet. The newspaper coverage of Hill's lecture in Los Angeles was picked up by a small number of other papers around California and the Southwest in the weeks following. Some of these articles added details that Hill himself had not mentioned in the Chamber of Commerce address. A few described artifacts in more specific terms: ceremonial objects, tools made from materials that did not match anything found elsewhere in the region, stone carvings depicting figures that some observers compared to descriptions of creatures in Native American oral traditions. One account mentioned mummified remains, though the description of those remains was vague enough to be interpreted several ways. What is notable about these early reports is not their content, which cannot be independently verified, but their timing. They appeared in a very narrow window, roughly 4 to 6 weeks after Hill's lecture, and then they stopped. Not gradually, not because better stories came along. They simply ceased. The follow-up coverage that would be expected after a story of this magnitude, the expedition reports, the expert commentary, the official denials or confirmations, none of it materialized. The story was there, and then it was not. Russell himself is a difficult figure to research. He does appear in records from the period. His medical background can be traced. His interest in the Death Valley region is documented in at least a few contemporaneous sources, but after 1947, his name essentially disappears from any public record connected to the tunnel story. He did not publish. He did not lecture. He did not give interviews to the newspapers that had briefly covered his work. Whether that silence was voluntary or encouraged from outside, no record makes clear. To understand why the Death Valley tunnel story resonates so deeply with people who study pre-Columbian American history, you have to understand something about the landscape of that history and the way it has been managed, interpreted, and in some cases deliberately narrowed over the past 2 centuries. The standard narrative of pre-Columbian North America, the one taught in schools and repeated in textbooks, is a story of nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples living in relatively small, relatively simple social groups, hunting animals, gathering plants, gradually developing agriculture in certain regions, building modest permanent structures in others. This narrative is not entirely wrong. There were indeed such peoples, but it is radically incomplete, and the incompleteness is not accidental. In the American Southwest alone, the evidence for complex, organized, large-scale pre-Columbian civilizations is overwhelming if you look at it honestly. The ancestral Puebloans, who built the cliff dwellings at Mesa Verde and the great houses at Chaco Canyon, were operating social and trading networks of extraordinary sophistication. Chaco Canyon in particular shows evidence of astronomical alignment in its architecture, long-distance trade routes that brought materials from hundreds of miles away, a level of civic planning that implies centralized organization of labor and resources on a scale that the old narrative simply cannot accommodate. Further south, the Hohokam people of what is now Arizona built an irrigation canal system that extended for hundreds of miles across the desert floor, a feat of engineering that required not just technical knowledge but institutional continuity over many generations. The canals are still visible from the air today. Some of them are still used, incorporated into modern irrigation systems in the Phoenix area, and these are just the examples that have been excavated and studied. The Mojave Desert, the Great Basin, the areas in and around Death Valley specifically, have received a fraction of the archaeological attention that other regions have gotten. The work that has been done there has produced results that are genuinely puzzling, petroglyphs that do not match known stylistic traditions, lake bed deposits that suggest periods of habitation during times when the regional climate would have supported much larger populations than it does today, alignments of stone that do not fit easily into the category of natural formation. The geological history of Death Valley is itself relevant here. The valley has not always been what it is now. In the relatively recent past, geologically speaking, the basin held a large lake. Lake Manly, as geologists have named it, covered much of the valley floor during the last glacial maximum, roughly 20,000 years ago, with depths estimated at around 600 feet in some sections. As the climate warmed and the Ice Age ended, the lake shrank and eventually evaporated, leaving behind the salt flats and dried mud deposits that characterize the valley floor today. The shoreline of that ancient lake is still visible on the valley walls as a pale horizontal line etched into the rock face. During the period when Lake Manly existed, and during the millennia of its slow recession, the region around Death Valley would have been dramatically different from what it is today. Cooler, wetter, biologically richer, a place that could have supported a substantial human population. And any tunnels built during that period, or even in the millennia following the lake's recession, would have been cut into a valley that was nothing like the lethal environment of the present. The question of who might have built tunnels beneath Death Valley, if tunnels exist there at all, opens onto one of the most contested and deliberately obscured areas of American prehistory. The question of very early, very advanced, and very poorly documented civilizations in North America. The academic consensus, maintained vigorously by most American universities and archaeological institutions, holds that complex civilization in the Americas developed relatively recently, in the last few thousand years, and was largely independent of Old World developments. The first people to reach North America, in this view, came across a land bridge from Asia no earlier than about 15,000 to 20,000 years ago, spread gradually southward, and developed culturally over the subsequent millennia in isolation from the rest of the human world. This model has been under sustained pressure for decades. Evidence keeps appearing that pushes the American timeline further back. The Monte Verde site in Chile, for example, was dated to roughly 14,800 years ago, which means humans were already at the southern tip of South America at a time when the land bridge model barely has them arriving in the north. Other sites have produced dates that the academic establishment has spent considerable energy arguing against, not because the dating methodology was flawed, but because the implications were unwelcome. In North America specifically, sites in the southeastern United States, in California, in the Great Plains, have produced evidence of human presence that significantly predates the conventional timeline. The Cerruti Mastodon site in San Diego, California, produced what appeared to be evidence of human activity associated with mastodon remains, dated to approximately 130,000 years ago. The paper announcing this finding, published in the journal Nature in 2017, was met with intense skepticism bordering on hostility from the mainstream archaeological community. Not because the methodology was clearly wrong, but because the conclusion was, in the words of one dissenting archaeologist, simply too extraordinary to accept without extraordinary evidence. That standard, too extraordinary to accept without extraordinary evidence, is an interesting one. It sounds reasonable, but it has a practical effect that is worth examining. It means that any evidence suggesting a pre-Columbian American civilization more complex or more ancient than the accepted model can always be dismissed on the grounds that the threshold of proof has not been met, regardless of how much evidence actually exists. The bar is set at a height that makes it functionally impossible to clear, because the bar itself moves whenever the evidence gets close. The 1,947 story was not the first time tunnels or underground structures in the Death Valley region had been mentioned in connection with pre-Columbian civilization. Several decades earlier, in the early years of the 20th century, accounts had appeared in newspapers and magazines describing Native American oral traditions that referenced a subterranean world beneath the desert. These accounts were collected, in some cases, by amateur ethnographers who were spending time with desert-dwelling peoples in California and Nevada. The oral traditions they recorded varied in their details but shared a general structure. They described a time long before the present, before even the oldest living memories extended, when the people of the desert lived in the earth rather than on it. Some accounts described entire cities beneath the surface, connected by tunnels that ran for great distances. Others spoke of a catastrophe, a time when the surface world became unlivable, a burning or a flooding or a darkness, and the people retreated underground to survive it. These oral traditions were not given serious scholarly attention at the time they were collected, and they have not received much serious attention since. They were filed under the category of mythology, which is the category that mainstream scholarship uses for things it finds culturally interesting but empirically inconvenient. The assumption embedded in that categorization is that oral traditions do not carry reliable historical information, that they are stories rather than records, metaphors rather than accounts. That assumption has been steadily eroded by research over the past several decades. Geologists studying Aboriginal Australian oral traditions discovered in the early 21st century that certain stories described specific geological events, including coastal flooding from sea level rise, with remarkable accuracy. When those stories were compared against the geological record, they matched. The events described had occurred, and the oral traditions had preserved accurate accounts of them for as long as 10,000 years. Similar findings have emerged from studies of oral traditions from other indigenous cultures around the world. The stories, it turns out, are not always just stories. The oral traditions of the desert peoples of the American Southwest are among the least studied and least taken seriously in American anthropology. This is partly a matter of access and relationship. The communities that hold these traditions have had, for understandable historical reasons, a complicated and often adversarial relationship with outside researchers. What has been documented tends to be what those communities chose to share, which is not necessarily the deepest or most specific layers of the tradition. What has been shared, in fragments collected over more than a century of fieldwork, is consistent in certain ways that are difficult to explain if the traditions have no basis in actual experience. The underground world appears again and again. The tunnels appear. The constructed passages, the chambers, the sense of a civilization that existed beneath the desert surface and left traces that the desert has not entirely erased. These themes run through multiple distinct cultural traditions across a region spanning hundreds of miles. The year 1947 was, as history enthusiasts know, an extraordinarily strange year in American life. The summer of that year produced two stories that have never been fully explained and that the official versions of have never been fully believed. In June, a pilot named Kenneth Arnold reported seeing objects flying near Mount Rainier in Washington state that he described as moving like saucers skipping across water. Within weeks, the term flying saucer had entered the American vocabulary and the modern UFO era had begun. In July, something crashed in the desert near Roswell, New Mexico, about 700 miles east of Death Valley. The Army Air Force initially announced the recovery of a flying disc. Within 24 hours, they retracted that statement and replaced it with an explanation involving a weather balloon. The Death Valley Tunnel story came from that same summer, that same desert region, that same atmosphere of sudden and unexplained official reticence about things found in the ground and in the sky of the American West. This is probably not coincidence. It is more likely a reflection of something happening in the American military and intelligence apparatus in 1947 that involved a significant and sudden interest in what was hidden in the deserts of the Southwest. An interest coupled with an equally significant and sudden interest in controlling what the public was told about it. The National Security Act of 1947 was signed into law in July of that year, the same month as Roswell, and within weeks of Howard Hill's Los Angeles lecture. That act created the modern American intelligence architecture, including the Central Intelligence Agency and the National Security Council. It represented a formal institutionalization of the principle that the government had the right and the duty to keep certain information from its citizens in the name of national security. The timing of that institutional change, coinciding with the most concentrated period of strange discoveries and official silence in the post-war desert Southwest, is at minimum worth noting. Whether or not there is a direct connection between the Death Valley Tunnel story and the broader security apparatus being built in Washington in that same summer, the practical effect was the same. Stories that had been appearing in newspapers went quiet. Researchers who had been speaking publicly fell silent. The public conversation about what might be hidden in the American desert, beneath it or in its sky, was sharply and efficiently curtailed. Among the specific claims made in connection with the 1947 Death Valley Tunnel story, the one that has received the most sustained attention from researchers in subsequent decades is the description of the tunnel construction itself. According to the accounts that circulated in the weeks after Hill's lecture, the passages were not rough-hewn. They were not the kind of irregular cave that forms naturally or that could be dug by hand with primitive tools. The walls were described as smooth in a way that suggested either a very high level of technical skill in stone finishing or a method of tunnel construction that was fundamentally different from anything in the standard archaeological record for North America. The specific word used in some of the early accounts was vitrified. This is a term that has appeared in a number of archaeological anomaly stories from around the world, and it refers to a process by which stone or soil is fused into a glassy surface through the application of extreme heat. Naturally occurring vitrification happens in volcanic environments, in lightning strike craters, in meteorite impact sites. Artificially produced vitrification requires temperatures that are extremely difficult to achieve with conventional fire, even with sophisticated furnace construction. Vitrified forts have been documented in Scotland and parts of continental Europe. Ancient stone structures where the walls show clear evidence of having been fused by heat so intense that the stone melted and resolidified. How the builders of these structures achieved those temperatures is not fully understood. The most commonly offered explanation, that the forts were burned after construction or during attack, does not fully account for the uniformity and completeness of the vitrification, in some cases, which seems to have required sustained and controlled heat application rather than a single burning event. If the walls of the Death Valley tunnels showed vitrification, that detail would place their construction in a category of pre-Columbian American archaeology for which there is essentially no existing framework. It would imply either a technology unknown in the Americas or contact with a tradition of construction that had developed elsewhere and been brought to this continent, or a much longer and more complex independent development of technical knowledge in the Americas than the current model allows for. The vitrification claim in the Death Valley accounts cannot be verified. The primary witnesses are unavailable. The location of the tunnel entrance has never been confirmed publicly, but the detail is specific enough, and it matches a pattern found elsewhere in the world consistently enough that it deserves more than casual dismissal. There is a man whose name comes up repeatedly in the deeper research into American archaeological anomalies from the early and mid-20th century, and his name is worth spending some time with here. His name was George Wharton James, and he was a writer, lecturer, and enthusiastic documentarian of the American Southwest who spent decades exploring the desert regions of California, Nevada, Arizona, and New Mexico in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. James was not a scientist. He was a popularizer, a type that has always been both essential and problematic in the study of the ancient world. His books and lectures introduced millions of Americans to the landscapes and indigenous cultures of the Southwest, and he was genuinely passionate about the subject. He was also loose with facts in ways that make him an unreliable primary source in any specific claim. But among the things he wrote about and discussed in his lectures was a persistent tradition among desert-dwelling peoples of underground structures, sealed passages, and a subterranean geography of the desert Southwest that was known to certain communities and concealed from outsiders. James was collecting these accounts in the early 1900s, decades before the 1947 tunnel story. The consistency between what he was hearing in the early 20th century and what Russell and Hill were describing in 1947 is not proof of anything, but it is the kind of consistency that serious researchers look for when they are trying to determine whether a tradition has genuine roots or whether it is being fabricated for effect. Another figure in this research lineage is Harold Gladwin, a serious archaeologist who spent years in the Southwest from the 1920s onward and who eventually became one of the most notable critics of the standard pre-Columbian timeline for the Americas. Gladwin's work at sites in Arizona produced evidence that he believed pointed toward cultural connections between pre-Columbian Americans and other civilizations around the Pacific, and even across the Atlantic. His conclusions were largely rejected by the academic establishment of his time, and his reputation suffered for it. But some of the specific evidence he documented, the distribution patterns of certain artifact types, the architectural similarities between southwestern structures and those found in distant parts of the world, has never been fully refuted. It has simply been set aside. The pattern with Gladwin, as with James before him and Russell in 1947, is the same. Find something that doesn't fit, report it. Face dismissal or silence, and then watch as the evidence you documented gets folded into the ongoing argument over whether it's real, while the thing itself, the artifact, the site, the tunnel, the structure, becomes less and less accessible with each passing decade. The Panamint Mountains, which form the western wall of Death Valley, have their own archaeological mystery layered on top of the tunnel story. The Panamints are not simply a mountain range separating the valley from the world beyond. They are an extraordinarily ancient geological formation, and within their canyons and on their ridgelines, there are traces of habitation that extend back far beyond what the standard timeline for the region can comfortably accommodate. Canyon walls in the Panamints contain petroglyphs that have been studied and disputed for decades. Some of these images are clearly identifiable. Animals, human figures, geometric patterns that appear in rock art traditions across the Southwest. But others are not easily classified. There are forms in the Panamint petroglyphs that researchers with serious credentials have described as unlike anything in the known corpus of North American rock art. The style is different. The subjects, in some cases, seem to be different. And the placement, deep in canyon systems that would have required significant effort to reach, suggests that whoever made these images was making them in places that were deliberately inaccessible. which is its own kind of statement. The Panamint Valley, which lies on the western side of the Panamint Range beyond Death Valley proper, has produced its own anomalous findings over the years. Dried lake beds in the Panamint Valley have yielded materials that were first investigated seriously in the 1970s, when a small number of researchers began documenting what appeared to be work stone and other cultural material in deposits that the geological stratigraphy placed at considerable depth. Depth in a geological deposit corresponds to age. Materials found deep in undisturbed sediment are old. How old depends on how quickly the sediment accumulated and whether the deposit has been disturbed by later activity. What some of these researchers claimed to be finding in the Panamint Valley lakebed deposits was cultural material, evidence of human activity, at depth suggesting an age that the official timeline could not accommodate. The findings were not published in peer-reviewed journals. They were shared in the kind of informal networks that existed before the internet, passed along between researchers who had learned that submitting their work to the academic mainstream was more likely to produce rejection and professional damage than serious engagement. The informal nature of this research is one of the persistent problems with the Death Valley Tunnel story and its extended family of related claims. Because the research was not conducted within institutional frameworks, it lacks the documentation standards that would make it reviewable. Because the findings were not published in peer-reviewed outlets, they cannot be cited in ways that the academic community recognizes as valid. This creates a circular situation where the evidence for anomalous findings cannot be taken seriously because it is not documented according to the standards that the institutions that reject it have established. The standards themselves function as a filter, one that seems designed less to ensure rigor than to ensure that certain conclusions remain permanently unreachable. Let's talk about the salt formations on the Death Valley floor, because they matter to the tunnel story in ways that are not immediately obvious. The salt flats that cover much of the valley bottom are not uniform. Beneath the flat, white surface, visible to tourists driving through the valley, the subsurface geology is complex and layered in ways that reflect millions of years of flooding, evaporation, mineral deposition, and tectonic activity. The valley sits on a fault system. Death Valley is geologically active in ways that are not always visible on the surface but are constantly shaping and reshaping what lies beneath it. The valley floor has risen and sunk, expanded and contracted, flooded and dried, over geological timescales that make the span of human civilization look like an afternoon. At various points in the valley's history, the underground water table has been dramatically higher than it is today. There are records, geological records in the form of mineral deposit patterns and sediment layers, of periods when the subsurface of the Death Valley Basin was extensively permeated with water. Caves formed during those periods. Natural passages developed where the water carved through softer rock layers. Some of those passages are still there, sealed now by the geological changes that lowered the water table and compacted the sediment above them. Natural caves in the Death Valley region have been known and documented for decades, and some of them are quite extensive. The lava tubes in the nearby Mojave Preserve extend for impressive distances underground. Cavern systems in the limestone formations of the surrounding ranges are still being explored and mapped. The underground geography of the region is considerably more complex than the flat, featureless valley floor suggests to the casual observer. The question that the 1,947 accounts raise, and that the oral traditions preceding them raise, is not really whether underground passages exist in the Death Valley region. They clearly do, in the form of natural geological formations. The question is whether some of those passages were modified or constructed by human hands, and whether those modifications were extensive enough to constitute something that could reasonably be called a tunnel system, or a subterranean complex, or whatever the most accurate description would be for what Russell and his colleagues believed they had found. If natural passages exist and were known to early inhabitants of the region, it is entirely plausible that those inhabitants would have modified and extended them. People throughout human history have done exactly that. The cliff dwellings of the ancestral Puebloans began with natural alcoves in canyon walls that were then extensively modified and built upon. The underground cities of Cappadocia in Turkey, where entire communities lived beneath the Earth's surface, began with natural volcanic formations that were then systematically carved into habitable spaces. The pattern of taking what nature provides and elaborating it is one of the most universal patterns in human construction history. If the desert peoples of the American Southwest had access to a network of natural passages beneath Death Valley, and if the climate conditions of 10,000 or 15,000 years ago made the surface of that region significantly more hospitable than it is today, while still presenting seasonal extremes, then the use of those underground passages as shelter, storage, ceremonial space, or even permanent habitation would be entirely consistent with what we know about how humans adapt to extreme environments. The specific location mentioned most often in connection with the 1,947 discoveries is the area around Wingate Pass, which lies at the southern end of the Panamint Range, near the border between Death Valley and the Panamint Valley. Wingate Pass was a significant route in the early history of Death Valley exploration and mining. It was one of the passages through which the famous 20-mule team borax wagons traveled in the 1880s, carrying the mineral from the valley floor to the railroad at Mojave. The pass is named for a military officer, Benjamin Wingate, who was involved in the Army's mapping expeditions through the region in the 1860s. The military interest in the pass during that period was driven by strategic concerns, specifically the need to understand the routes through the desert that could be used for troop movement. The mapping expeditions were thorough, and the reports they produced have been archived, though not all of those reports have been made fully public. There is a persistent claim in the research literature surrounding the Death Valley tunnels that the military conducted its own investigation of the region in the late 1940s and early 1950s, and that this investigation was related to reports of underground structures similar to those described by Russell. The claim is specific in some versions, that Army personnel entered the region, confirmed the existence of passages, and then deliberately sealed or obscured the entrances. The claim is not documented in any publicly available record. What is documented is that the military presence in the Death Valley region increased dramatically in the post-war period. The China Lake Naval Air Weapons Station, which borders Death Valley to the southwest, was established in 1943 and expanded significantly in the years following the war. Restricted military land in the region covers an enormous area, much of it inaccessible to civilians and largely unstudied by anyone outside the military. The boundary between public land in Death Valley National Park and restricted military land in the surrounding areas creates a patchwork geography where certain sections of what was once accessible desert have become permanently closed to independent investigation. Whether the military restrictions in the Death Valley region have anything to do with underground archaeology is not something that can be established from publicly available information. What can be established is that the restrictions exist, that they cover areas that are geologically and archaeologically interesting by any standard, and that they create an effective barrier to the kind of independent research that would be required to either confirm or definitively rule out the claims associated with the 1,947 story. There is a category of archaeological discovery that keeps appearing in the American record and keeps being dismissed, and it involves what might broadly be called giant remains. Reports of human skeletal material found in burial mounds, cave deposits, and subsurface excavations that describe bones suggesting individuals of extraordinary physical stature have appeared in American newspapers, local records, and historical accounts since at least the early 19th century. The Smithsonian Institution has been at the center of multiple allegations related to this category of evidence. In 2012, a satirical website published a fabricated story claiming the Smithsonian had admitted to destroying thousands of giant skeletons. That fabrication spread widely and muddied the waters around what is actually a more interesting and more carefully documented set of claims. The serious version of the Smithsonian allegations does not involve dramatic admissions. It involves a pattern that researchers have traced through the institution's own records, mound excavations from the 19th and early 20th centuries that produced skeletal material described in the field reports as anomalously large, material that was sent to the Smithsonian and that subsequently disappeared from the institutional record. No destruction is claimed, just absence. Just the quiet inability to locate materials that the records show were sent in, catalogued, and received. The connection to the Death Valley Tunnel story and to the broader tradition of pre-Columbian underground structures in the Southwest is thematic rather than evidentiary. Both involve the claim of physical evidence that was documented, briefly entered public consciousness, and then became unavailable. Both involve institutions that had the power and the interest to control what became of that evidence. Both sit at the intersection of archaeology and a kind of institutional management of historical narrative that operates below the level of public accountability. The Death Valley Tunnel accounts do mention, in their most detailed versions, the presence of unusual remains within the tunnel system. The descriptions vary. Some accounts mention mummified figures, others describe skeletal material. The details are not consistent enough across different accounts to establish a clear picture, but the presence of remains in a sealed underground space would not be archaeologically surprising. Many of the world's most significant archaeological discoveries have been made in exactly those conditions, in sealed chambers and closed passages, where the absence of air circulation and the stability of the underground environment preserved organic material that would have long since decomposed on the surface. What makes the remains claim in the Death Valley accounts distinctive, and what has driven some of the more persistent speculation around the tunnel story, is the reported scale of certain of these figures. The most specific accounts describe them as larger than any human remains in the standard archaeological record for North America. This is where the story shades most clearly into territory that most people's skepticism instinctively marks as the region of legend rather than report. And yet the consistency of this type of claim across different sources, different time periods, and different geographical areas is the kind of pattern that, in any other context, would be considered worth investigating rather than immediately dismissing. The academic response to claims of advanced pre-Columbian civilization in North America has been, for most of the 20th century, a pattern of aggressive dismissal followed by the occasional quiet incorporation of specific findings once they have become impossible to ignore. The process by which the ancestral Puebloan civilization went from being described in popular literature as a primitive cliff-dwelling people to being recognized as a sophisticated, long-distance trading civilization with complex astronomical knowledge and regional political influence is instructive. The evidence for that sophistication was always there. It took decades for the institutional framework to catch up with what the physical evidence was clearly showing. The case of the Poverty Point culture in Louisiana is similar. Poverty Point is a complex of earthen mounds near the Arkansas border in northeastern Louisiana that was built approximately 3,500 years ago. The main earthwork, a series of concentric semicircular ridges enclosing an area of roughly 400 acres, is one of the largest and most precisely engineered earthen monuments in the ancient world. For many years it was classified as a hunter-gatherer site, which was a way of saying that the people who built it were not supposed to be capable of the kind of organized labor and long-term planning that such a project obviously required. Eventually, the sheer scale and precision of the earthworks forced a reclassification. Poverty Point is now recognized as a complex urban center, one of the earliest in North America, representing a civilization that traded materials across an enormous geographic range. The recategorization of Poverty Point did not happen quickly or easily. It happened because the evidence was so overwhelming that continued dismissal would have required a level of motivated reasoning that even the most resistant scholars could not sustain. The question for researchers looking at the Death Valley Tunnel story is whether there exists somewhere, in archives or in the ground itself, a body of evidence that has not yet reached that threshold, or whether the deliberate obscuring of the evidence that took place in and after 1947 was thorough enough to keep it from ever reaching that threshold. Let's think carefully about the geography of what Russell was describing, because the specifics matter. Death Valley is roughly 130 miles long and up to 15 miles wide. The valley floor, which is where the most extreme conditions are found, sits at that low elevation below sea level. But the valley is not one undifferentiated landscape. It has distinct sections with distinct geological characters. The northern part of the valley, around Ubahibe crater and the racetrack player, is volcanic in character. The central section, from Furnace Creek south toward Badwater, is dominated by the salt flats and alluvial fans. The southern section, toward the area around Shoreline Butte and into the approaches to Wingate Pass, is where the oldest exposed geological formations in the valley are found. The oldest rocks in Death Valley are some of the oldest surface exposures in the western United States. The Precambrian formations visible in certain sections of the valley walls are roughly 1.7 billion years old. These ancient rocks have been folded, faulted, and intruded upon by younger geological events for hundreds of millions of years. The result is a subsurface structure of extraordinary complexity, one that a detailed geological survey would require years to fully characterize. Within that complex subsurface geology, the existence of natural passages is not just possible, it is geologically expected. The fault systems that run through the valley have created fracture zones in the rock that water has exploited over millions of years. The carbonate rock formations in the surrounding ranges are extensively cavernous. The alluvial fill on the valley floor sits atop bedrock that is itself riddled with the fractures and voids that tectonic activity creates. An experienced explorer with knowledge of the regional geology could, in principle, locate natural passages in this environment. Someone with sufficient knowledge of where the bedrock fractures run, where the water table has historically been, where the contact zones between different rock types create pathways through the subsurface, could navigate to underground openings that would not be visible or apparent from the surface. Russell's background in medicine rather than geology is actually not as disqualifying as it might seem. Medical practice in the early and mid-20th century, particularly in rural and frontier contexts, required a practical knowledge of the natural world that many physicians developed alongside their clinical training. A doctor who spent years in the desert Southwest, as Russell evidently did, would have had ample opportunity to learn the landscape in ways that a geologist visiting for a single field season might not. The question of who, specifically, built the tunnels that Russell described, assuming they exist, is one that the available evidence does not allow to answer with any confidence. But it is worth considering the range of possibilities because the dismissal of the tunnel story often rests on an implicit assumption that no known pre-Columbian culture in North America could have built something of this kind, and that assumption is not as solid as it might appear. The Hohokam people, who occupied the desert Southwest from roughly 300 CE to roughly 1,500 CE, were accomplished underground engineers. Their canal system, as mentioned earlier, extended for hundreds of miles. The engineering required for that system, the understanding of hydrology, gradient, soil mechanics, the management of labor over long periods of time, was sophisticated by any standard. People with the organizational and technical capacity to build hundreds of miles of irrigation canals across difficult desert terrain were people with the organizational and technical capacity to construct substantial underground passages. Before the Hohokam, the archaeological record of the Sonoran Desert and the surrounding region becomes rapidly thinner. What research has been done on pre-Hohokam occupation of the region suggests a succession of cultures stretching back several thousand years, each one less well documented than the one that followed it. The further back you go, the less we know. This is partly a function of time and preservation, and partly a function of where research effort has been directed. Outside the Hohokam tradition, there are the Patayam people of the lower Colorado River and the western Arizona desert who occupied the region for at least 1,500 years and whose territory extended into the Mojave. The Patayan are significantly less studied than the Hohokam or the ancestral Puebloans. Their cultural remains are harder to date and harder to characterize. They did not build the kind of monumental architecture that draws archaeological attention, but they were there, occupying some of the most extreme desert environments in North America for a very long time. Before the Patayan, before the cultures we have names for, the archaeological record becomes a genuine terra incognita. We know that people were in the Mojave Desert at least 12,000 years ago, and probably much longer. We do not know who they were, how many of them there were, or what they were capable of building. There is a detail in some versions of the Death Valley Tunnel story that deserves attention because it connects to a much broader and better documented phenomenon in world archaeology. That detail is the report of ancient technology associated with the tunnel system, artifacts found within the passages that did not match the technological level expected of pre-Columbian North Americans. The vagueness of these descriptions is frustrating, but also in a way consistent with what you would expect from people who encountered something they did not have the framework to fully categorize. The accounts describe objects that witnesses could not identify, materials that did not look like anything in the standard material culture of the American Southwest, forms that suggested function, but whose specific function was not apparent. Compare this to what happened when the Antikythera mechanism was first recovered from a Greek shipwreck in 1901. The divers who found it described what appeared to be corroded bronze fragments. For decades, the mechanism sat in a museum case, its significance unrecognized, because the paradigm for ancient Greek technology did not include the possibility of an astronomical calculating device of the complexity the mechanism represented. It was not until the application of X-ray imaging in the 1970s that the full sophistication of the device became apparent. Prior to that, even the experts who examined it could not fully articulate what they were looking at. The people who reportedly entered the Death Valley tunnels in 1947 were not archaeologists. They were a doctor with an amateur interest in pre-Columbian history and whatever colleagues and companions he had brought along. When they describe objects they could not identify, that description is not necessarily evidence of fabrication. It may be an accurate account of the experience of encountering unfamiliar things without the conceptual vocabulary to describe them precisely. What is consistent across the accounts of the tunnel artifacts is the sense that they were made with a level of precision and sophistication that exceeded what the witness expected to find. The smoothness of certain objects, the regularity of certain forms, the apparent durability of materials that had survived for an indeterminate period underground without the degradation one would expect. The indigenous oral traditions of the Mojave Desert region contain, in their most complete and least filtered versions, descriptions of a world beneath the ground that is more detailed and more specific than the general underground world motif found across many cultures worldwide. Among the Chemehuevi people, who have lived in the Mojave Desert for centuries, and who are the cultural descendants of much older desert-dwelling peoples, there are stories of underground places that are described not metaphorically but topographically. Not a spirit world, but a physical world, a world of passages and chambers and underground spaces that connects different surface locations through routes that run beneath the desert floor. The Chemehuevi traditional territory overlaps significantly with the Death Valley region and the surrounding desert. Their stories about underground geography have been collected, incompletely and often without adequate cultural context, by researchers since the late 19th century. The fullest published account of Chemehuevi oral literature comes from the work of ethnographer Carabeth Laird, who spent years in close contact with the community, and whose book, published in 1976, contains the most systematic treatment of Chemehuevi traditional knowledge available in print. Laird's work makes clear that the underground geography in Chemehuevi tradition is not a single unified narrative but a cluster of related stories and references, some of which speak to specific locations and specific physical features in ways that are more consistent with memory of actual places than with purely symbolic or mythological construction. Whether those memories, transmitted orally across generations, preserve accurate information about physical features beneath the desert surface is a question that cannot be answered without access to those physical features. The neighboring Mojave people, who occupy the lower Colorado River Valley to the southeast, have their own traditions involving underground spaces and beings associated with them. The Mojave origin stories include accounts of a world beneath the surface, and of passages between the underground world and the surface world through specific physical locations that are identified by name in the tradition, Some of these named locations correspond to places in the physical landscape that are identifiable on modern maps. Further north, among the Paiute people who occupied large parts of Nevada and the Great Basin, there are traditions of a people who lived in the earth, beneath the desert surface, who were encountered by the ancestors of the Paiute at some point in the deep past. These underground people are described in ways that distinguish them from the Paiute themselves, as physically different, culturally different, as ancient in ways that the Paiute traditions acknowledge without fully explaining. The persistence of underground world traditions across multiple distinct cultural groups throughout the Death Valley region and the surrounding desert is not by itself proof of anything. But it is exactly the kind of convergent testimony that careful researchers have learned to take seriously. When multiple independent traditions, from peoples with distinct languages, distinct histories, and distinct cultural frameworks, describe the same geographical feature in consistent terms, the possibility that they are all independently inventing the same fiction becomes harder to maintain than the possibility that they are all independently remembering the same reality. Let's take stock of what the physical evidence around Death Valley actually shows, setting aside the tunnel story itself for a moment and looking at the documented record. Petroglyphs in the region, some of which have been dated through the patina development on the rock surface to ages of several thousand years, include forms that have not been successfully matched to any known cultural tradition in North America. These anomalous petroglyphs are not widely publicized. The most commonly discussed rock art sites in Death Valley National Park are those that fit recognizable stylistic categories that can be attributed to known cultural traditions and that support the standard narrative. The less classifiable images are documented in technical reports but do not feature prominently in public interpretation. Ancient shoreline features around the valley floor include terracing and cut features that some researchers have interpreted as evidence of deliberate modification of the ancient lakeshore, rather than purely natural erosion. These features were studied in the 1980s and 1990s by a small number of researchers, and the interpretations they produced were sufficiently ambiguous that they were neither confirmed nor definitively ruled out. The features exist. What they mean is contested. Below ground, geophysical surveys conducted for various purposes over the years have mapped subsurface structures in the Death Valley region that include voids and anomalies consistent with cave or passage formation. These surveys have not been conducted with the specific intention of locating archaeological features, and the geological interpretation of such anomalies is complex. A void in a geophysical survey could be a natural cave, a water-filled pocket, a geological artifact of faulting, or, in principle, a constructed passage. Distinguishing between these possibilities requires physical investigation that has not been publicly conducted in the areas of greatest interest. The documented presence of natural caves in the surrounding ranges is extensive. The limestone formations of the Spring Mountains to the east of Death Valley include cavern systems of considerable extent. The volcanic formations to the north include lava tubes that have not been fully mapped. The fault zones running through the valley itself create the conditions for subsurface voids that surface investigation would never reveal. In short, the physical setting of the Death Valley Tunnel story is one in which underground passages of various origins are known to exist, in which the subsurface has not been comprehensively investigated, in which indigenous oral traditions consistently describe underground features, and in which the documented archaeological record is incomplete in ways that are at least partly a function of insufficient research rather than absence of evidence. The story of the Death Valley tunnels intersects with a broader pattern of suppression or neglect that runs through American archaeological history in ways that are worth examining carefully. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990, known as NAGPRA, was a landmark piece of legislation that required federal agencies and institutions receiving federal funding to return Native American human remains, sacred objects, and items of cultural patrimony to the tribal nations from which they originated. The passage of NAGPRA reflected a recognition that the systematic removal and warehousing of Native American cultural materials by museums and universities over the preceding century had been a form of cultural and spiritual injury. What Nagpur also did, as a practical matter, was significantly complicate the process of archaeological excavation on federal land. The requirements for tribal consultation and the restrictions on what could be done with human remains found at excavation sites added layers of regulatory complexity that changed the economics and logistics of archaeological field work. Some researchers have argued that these requirements have slowed the investigation of pre-Columbian sites in ways that have left important questions unresolved. Others have argued that the slowing was appropriate and that the previous century of archaeology had operated with a disregard for indigenous rights that needed to be corrected. The relevance to the Death Valley Tunnel story is indirect but real. If human remains were found in those tunnels in 1947, as some accounts suggest, and if those remains were associated with cultural materials and a burial context, then any attempt to reinvestigate the site today would need to navigate a complex regulatory and relational landscape involving tribal consultation, Nagpur compliance, and the various federal agencies that have jurisdiction over different sections of the Death Valley region. The jurisdictional complexity of the Death Valley area is itself a significant obstacle to independent investigation. The national park boundaries, the military reservation boundaries, the BLM land, the state land, and the privately held parcels create a patchwork of different legal frameworks that a serious archaeological expedition would need to navigate. The kind of informal, minimally documented exploration that Russell apparently conducted in the 1940s is simply not possible today, regardless of what one might or might not find. There is a phenomenon in scientific and academic history that philosopher of science Thomas Kuhn called paradigm protection, though Kuhn himself used the term paradigm shift rather than paradigm protection. The basic insight is that scientific communities operate within shared frameworks of assumption and expectation, and that evidence which challenges those frameworks tends to be received with resistance that is not entirely rational. Data that fits the paradigm is published and cited. Data that contradicts the paradigm is scrutinized more intensely, held to higher standards of proof, and when it cannot be dismissed outright, is ignored rather than integrated. In American archaeology, the dominant paradigm for most of the 20th century involved a set of assumptions about when humans arrived in the Americas, what they were capable of building and organizing, and how complex their social structures were, that has proven to be consistently wrong on the conservative side. Repeatedly, evidence has forced revisions in the direction of greater antiquity, greater complexity, and more sophisticated cultural development than the preceding model allowed for. Each of these revisions has followed a similar pattern. Initial discovery produces resistance. Evidence accumulates to a point where continued resistance is professionally embarrassing. A new, slightly revised model is adopted that accommodates the specific evidence, forcing the revision while maintaining as many of the prior assumptions as possible. The new model is then defended against the next wave of anomalous findings with the same vigor that the old model was defended. The Death Valley Tunnel story, if it is taken seriously at all, represents a potential revision of a much more fundamental kind than any that has yet been forced upon mainstream American archaeology. It implies not a slightly deeper timeline or a slightly more complex social structure, but an entirely different architecture of pre-Columbian American history, one in which substantial, deliberately constructed underground infrastructure existed in at least some parts of the continent, implying a level of organized labor, technical skill, and institutional continuity that the current model has no room for. That is precisely why the story has been kept at the margins. Not because it has been proven false, it has not been proven false, but because, if true, it would require not a revision but a replacement of the existing model, and institutional science does not welcome replacements. Among the people who have taken the Death Valley Tunnel story seriously and investigated it with whatever tools were available to them over the decades since 1947, there is a researcher whose work deserves particular mention. His name is not important for the purposes of this account, but his approach is. He spent years in the late 1970s and 1980s attempting to trace the documentary record of the 1,947 discoveries, not by trying to locate the tunnels themselves, but by trying to reconstruct who had been involved, what they had seen, and what had happened to the physical evidence they described. What this researcher found, through archival work and interviews with people who had known or worked with Russell, was a picture that was frustratingly incomplete but suggestive in specific ways. Russell had spoken about the tunnels to a small number of colleagues and associates in the years before Hill's lecture. The accounts Russell gave in those private conversations were more detailed than what Hill relayed publicly. They included specifics about the tunnel layout, the direction of the main passage, the depth below the surface at which certain chambers were found. They also included Russell's theory about what the tunnels were, who had built them, and when. Russell's private theory, according to the people who heard him describe it, was that the tunnels predated any culture in the current archaeological record for North America. He believed he was looking at evidence of a civilization that had occupied the Death Valley region during a period when the climate was fundamentally different, when the valley supported a much larger and more complex human presence than anything in the current landscape suggests. He dated the construction, speculatively, to the period of Lake Manly's recession, the long transition from a wetter, cooler environment to the extreme desert of the present. Whether Russell had evidence for that specific theory, or was extrapolating from the physical character of what he found, is unclear. But the theory itself is not unreasonable by any standard. The gradual drying of the lake bed would have created conditions that could motivate exactly the kind of underground construction that Russell described. As the surface became progressively more hostile, a population that had the knowledge and the organizational capacity might have responded by moving its habitation underground, extending and systematizing the natural passages that the geological history of the region had already created. The mummies. Let's address them directly, because they are one of the most specific and most potentially verifiable aspects of the 1,947 accounts. Multiple versions of the Death Valley Tunnel story describe the discovery of mummified human remains within the passages. The descriptions vary in their specifics, but there are consistent elements. The remains were found in positions that suggested intentional placement rather than accidental death. Some accounts describe them as being in chambers that appeared to have been prepared as burial spaces. The preservation of the remains was described as extraordinary, which is consistent with the conditions one would expect in a sealed underground environment in an extremely dry climate. The mummies of Death Valley are not entirely without precedent in the archaeological record of the region. Mummified human remains have been found in various locations in the desert southwest under conditions of natural preservation. The Pyramid Lake mummies of Nevada, found in a dry cave above the ancient shoreline of Pyramid Lake, were among the first prehistoric mummies scientifically studied in North America. Carbon dating, performed in the 1990s, placed some of the Pyramid Lake materials at more than 9,000 years old. These are real, documented, studied, and accepted remains that demonstrate both the capacity of the desert environment to preserve organic material over very long periods, and the reality of a pre-Columbian human presence in the Great Basin region that substantially predates the conventional timeline. The Spirit Cave mummy, found near Fallon, Nevada in 1940, just 7 years before the Death Valley Tunnel story, was preserved well enough that facial features were clearly discernible. When it was radiocarbon dated in 1996, the result came back at approximately 9,400 years before present. The Spirit Cave mummy was found with woven textiles and other cultural materials that demonstrated a level of technical sophistication in weaving that was not supposed to exist in North America at that date. The story of the Spirit Cave mummy's subsequent history, including a 2-decade dispute between the scientific community and the Fallon Paiute Shoshone tribe over the disposition of the remains under NAGPRA, is itself a complex and unresolved chapter in American archaeology. The point is that ancient, well-preserved mummified remains from the desert southwest are real. They have been found. They have been studied. Some of what they show about the antiquity and sophistication of human presence in the region has been genuinely surprising. In that context, the claim that mummified remains were found in underground passages in Death Valley in 1947 is not inherently absurd. It is consistent with what is known to be possible in the regional environment. What happened to those remains, if they existed, is unknown. The most benign possibility is that they were removed, transferred to an institution, and are sitting in storage somewhere without clear provenance documentation. The less benign possibilities are that they were either deliberately concealed or that the documentation of their discovery was suppressed along with the rest of the tunnel story. There is a particular quality to the silence that surrounds the Death Valley tunnel story that distinguishes it from the silence surrounding simple hoaxes or fabrications. When a hoax is exposed, the exposure typically generates more narrative, more discussion, more documentation of the exposure itself than the original false claim did. The Cardiff Giant, the Piltdown Man, the various invented antiquities that have periodically appeared in the archaeological record, all of these left substantial documentation of their unmasking. The Death Valley tunnel story was never unmasked. It was never formally investigated and found wanting. It was never subjected to a serious critical examination that produced a documented refutation. It simply stopped being discussed, in the mainstream press and in academic circles, with a speed and completeness that is itself anomalous. The silence is not the silence of dismissal. It is the silence of avoidance. These are different things, and the difference matters. Dismissal produces documentation. The critical review, the replication failure, the expert consensus statement. Avoidance produces nothing. It leaves the story where it was, neither confirmed nor refuted, floating in the space between the known and the unknown, inaccessible to the ordinary processes of investigation. That the story has survived in popular consciousness for nearly 80 years despite that silence is itself significant. Stories that are simply false tend to die. They lose their hold on people's attention once the emotional charge that launched them has faded. The stories that persist are the ones that carry some kind of unresolved charge, some sense of something genuinely unexplained at their core. The Death Valley tunnel story persists not because people are gullible, but because the questions it raises have never been answered. Let's turn to something concrete: the geology of tunnel formation in the Mojave and Death Valley region, and what it would take to find evidence of artificial tunnel modification if such modification existed. Lava tubes are the most extensive and most well-documented form of natural underground passage in the Mojave region. These form when the outer crust of a lava flow solidifies, while molten rock continues to flow through the interior, eventually draining out and leaving a hollow tube behind. The Mojave Preserve to the southeast of Death Valley contains lava tubes that extend for impressive distances, some of them accessible to the public, and some accessible only to researchers with permits. In areas of volcanic activity, lava tubes can form networks of considerable complexity. Multiple tubes running parallel or intersecting, secondary tubes branching from main passages, collapse pits where the tube roof has given way, all of these features create the kind of underground geography that, to a person encountering it without prior knowledge, might be describable as a tunnel system. The visual impression of a lava tube interior, smooth basalt walls shaped by flowing rock, a high arching ceiling, a level floor, is not entirely unlike the description of worked stone passages. But lava tubes have a distinctive geological signature that distinguishes them from constructed passages. The curvature of the walls follows the flow patterns of the original lava. The cross-sections are typically rounded or oval. The floor is rarely perfectly level. The junctions between tubes show the characteristic geometry of fluid dynamics rather than the right angles or planned intersections of deliberate construction. If the passages Russell described were described as straight, with level floors and worked walls, that description would be inconsistent with a lava tube. It would point toward either deliberate construction or modification of a natural passage to create a more uniform and functional space. The dissolution caves found in carbonate rock formations in the ranges surrounding Death Valley have a different character. These form through the slow chemical dissolution of limestone and dolomite by acidic water, producing irregular chambers and passages that follow fracture zones and bedding planes in the rock. They are typically irregular in cross-section, with rough walls, variable ceiling heights, and floor surfaces that reflect the undulating bedrock. Dissolution caves can be very extensive, and some of the most important archaeological sites in the American Southwest are found in them, but they do not naturally produce the kind of regular, engineered appearance that the Death Valley accounts describe. The subsurface geology of Death Valley itself, below the valley floor, is less well characterized than either the volcanic formations to the south or the carbonate formations in the surrounding ranges. The valley fill, the material that has accumulated on the valley floor over millions of years of erosion and deposition, sits atop a basement of metamorphic and igneous rock that is extensively fractured by the fault systems crossing the valley. In those fractured zones, passages could exist that are neither lava tubes nor dissolution caves, but simple voids in broken rock that have been enlarged and connected by water movement over geological time. These rock fracture passages are the hardest to characterize from the surface, because they do not fit neatly into either of the standard categories for underground passages. They can be large or small, regular or irregular, depending on the specific geology. And they are the type of passage that someone with knowledge of where the major fault zones run could potentially locate and access in ways that would not be obvious to someone without that knowledge. There are people alive today, or who were alive until recently, who have personal family knowledge of the Death Valley region going back several generations. Not researchers or archaeologists, but families who have worked the land, mined it, ranched on its margins, or simply lived in proximity to it for decades. Among those families, there are stories. Not all of these stories have been publicly shared, and not all of them should be. Some involve things seen or found that the families chose to keep private, either out of distrust of outside authorities, out of concern for the cultural and spiritual significance of what they encountered, or simply because the habits of people who live in difficult, isolated country tend toward privacy rather than disclosure. But some have been shared in conversations with researchers, in letters, in the oral histories that local historical societies have sometimes managed to collect before the people who hold them are gone. The general content of these personal accounts, the stories that families in the Death Valley region have passed down through the 20th century, overlaps in specific and meaningful ways with the 1947 tunnel story. Not because those families were followers of Russell or Hill, most of them had never heard of either man, but because they had their own independent experiences of the underground landscape of the region, their own encounters with passages and chambers that should not have been there, or that were more regular and more clearly shaped than natural geology alone could explain. A retired miner, interviewed in the 1990s by a researcher working on a local history project, described an experience from his father's time working a claim in the southern Panamints in the 1930s. His father had broken through into a passage while excavating a new drift. The passage was not connected to any known geological feature. It ran straight, it was clearly old, and it was sealed at both ends at points his father could not reach before the cost and logistics of investigation became prohibitive. His father had mentioned it to a couple of people, been told nothing sensible in response, and eventually closed up the drift and moved on. A woman from a Shoshone family in the Beatty area, interviewed as part of an oral history project in the early 2000s, described a story her grandmother had told her about places in the desert that went inside the earth in ways that were not natural, in ways that had been made. Her grandmother had known the locations of several such places and had been clear that they were not to be entered, not out of spiritual prohibition alone, but because certain of them were dangerous in physical terms, structurally unstable or connected to areas where the air was bad. These are fragments. They are not evidence in any rigorous sense, but they are the kind of fragments that accumulate in the research surrounding unexplained phenomena into a weight that begins to feel like more than coincidence. The broader question that the Death Valley Tunnel story raises, and that it shares with a number of other unexplained archaeological stories from the American Southwest, is a question about what we are prepared to accept about the past. The standard model of American prehistory is not simply a description of what the evidence shows. It is a framework built around a set of prior assumptions, most of them inherited from the intellectual culture of the 19th century, when American archaeology as a discipline was forming. Those assumptions included a set of ideas about human capability and cultural evolution that reflected the racial and cultural hierarchies of that period, ideas that positioned European civilization as the apex of human development and located other cultures at various points below it on an ascending scale. The practical consequence of those assumptions was a predisposition to interpret American pre-Columbian evidence as showing a certain level of development but not exceeding it. When evidence seemed to exceed it, the evidence was the problem, not the assumption. This is not an accusation against individual researchers, most of whom were working within the intellectual constraints of their time and culture. It is an observation about how paradigms work, and about the persistence of paradigm-shaping assumptions long after the explicit beliefs that generated them have been abandoned. The assumption that no pre-Columbian North American culture could have built underground tunnel systems of the kind described in the Death Valley accounts is not the result of exhaustive investigation followed by negative findings. It is the result of a prior belief that such construction falls outside the capability range of any culture that was present in North America before European contact. That prior belief has never been tested against the specific question of whether underground construction of this kind existed. It has simply been assumed to settle the question without testing. Challenging that assumption does not require accepting every specific claim in the Death Valley Tunnel story. It requires only recognizing that the question of what pre-Columbian North Americans were capable of building has not been conclusively answered, that the research addressing that question has been incomplete and in some cases clearly biased, and that the dismissal of specific evidence on the basis of prior assumption is not the same as the scientific refutation of that evidence. There is a document that circulates in the research community surrounding the Death Valley Tunnel story, a document that purports to be a partial transcript of a conversation between Howard Hill and an unnamed interlocutor, possibly a journalist, recorded some years after the 1947 lecture. The document's provenance is unclear, and its authenticity cannot be established from publicly available information, but certain details within it are consistent with what is known from other sources, and it contains one passage that is worth recounting here, with the caveat that its authenticity is unverified. In this document, Hill is described as saying that the most remarkable thing about the tunnels was not their construction, but their apparent purpose. He described the passages as organized not for the movement of people through the landscape, but for a different kind of function, one that he could not fully characterize but that reminded him, he said, of the way a library is organized, or a archive, or a place where things are meant to be kept rather than used. The chambers within the system were not living spaces. In his account of what Russell had described to him, they were storage spaces, or something like storage spaces, for things that Russell had found and had not been able to fully describe or explain. Whether this account is genuine or fabricated, the image it conveys is one of an underground repository, a place where a civilization or culture had deliberately placed materials intended to survive, to endure, to be preserved against the processes of time and surface exposure. The concept of a deliberate repository for cultural or technical knowledge is not strange in world history. The library at Alexandria, the archives of ancient Mesopotamia, the buried books of the Chinese Empire, the hiding of the Dead Sea Scrolls in the caves above Qumran, across many cultures and many periods, human beings have created deliberate systems for preserving knowledge in protected locations. If the pre-Columbian inhabitants of the Death Valley region had developed the capacity to recognize that their civilization was facing conditions that threatened its continuity, whether from the progressive desiccation of the climate, from conflict with other groups, from whatever crisis their oral traditions describe when they speak of the people going underground, a response of deliberate preservation, the hiding of cultural materials in an engineered underground space, would be entirely consistent with patterns of human behavior across the full historical record. What that would mean for the present is difficult to fully articulate. The materials preserved in such a repository, if they existed and if they survived, would be among the most significant archaeological discoveries in human history. They would not simply add data points to the existing model of pre-Columbian American culture. They would require that model to be rebuilt from the ground up. The question of what happened after 1947, after the brief burst of newspaper coverage and then the silence, is one that can be partially addressed through inference, if not through direct documentation. What we know is that the post-war period in American life was marked by an extraordinary expansion of federal power over land and information in the American West. The Atomic Energy Commission was acquiring enormous tracts of desert land for testing purposes. The military was building and expanding installations throughout the Southwest. The newly reorganized intelligence apparatus was developing the institutional habits and the legal frameworks that would define its operation for the rest of the century. In that environment, the discovery of an anomalous underground structure in a remote desert region would have attracted a specific kind of official attention, one focused less on the historical and archaeological significance of the discovery than on its implications for existing or planned activity in the region, on the question of what other unexpected features might be present in the landscape, and on the management of public information about things found in the ground of the American West during a period of intense and sometimes classified construction and testing activity. The practical result of that kind of official attention would not necessarily be a deliberate cover-up in any dramatic sense. It might simply be the quiet application of existing bureaucratic machinery to the problem of a story that touched on land use questions that the government was not prepared to address publicly. The appropriate agencies would be notified. The land in question would be carefully noted. The people talking about it would be, without drama or confrontation, discouraged from continuing to talk, and the story would fade, not because it was false, but because the institutions with the power to investigate it had decided, for their own reasons, not to. The salt formations of Death Valley have a property that is not widely known outside geological circles. In certain conditions, the salt crust on the valley floor is not a solid surface, but a thin crust over empty space. The evaporation of the ancient lake left not just a flat salt surface, but a layered geology beneath it, with alternating beds of salt, clay, and gravel extending to considerable depth. In some sections of the valley, the subsurface geology includes voids, cavities in the salt, and clay matrix, where subsidence or chemical processes have created open spaces below the surface crust. Walking on the Death Valley salt flats, you are sometimes walking on a surface that is significantly thinner than it appears, over spaces that descend into the geological complexity beneath. This is not a secret. Visitors to the valley are warned about unstable areas of the salt crust in certain sections. The practical danger is of breaking through to softer material below, not of falling into a cave, but the principle is the same. The surface is not always what it appears to be. This property of the valley floor matters, because it means that an underground space, whether natural or constructed, would not necessarily be detectable from the surface through visual observation alone. The crust might show no sign of what lies beneath it, a passage that had been entered by breaking through the surface and then resealing the entry point would be effectively invisible to anyone who did not know exactly where to look. If someone wanted to seal an underground entry point in Death Valley, the salt crust provides an ideal medium. It is self-repairing in certain senses. Evaporation continuously deposits new salt on the surface, salt flows and settles under its own weight, and the desert winds carry fine salt particles that accumulate and fill depressions. An opening sealed with loose material and allowed to sit through a few seasons of desert weather would be indistinguishable from the surrounding surface within a relatively short time. The deliberate resealing of tunnel entrances, if that occurred, would not have required dramatic engineering. It would have required only the application of locally available materials and sufficient time for the desert environment to complete the process of concealment. The same extreme environment that makes Death Valley so hostile to human presence also makes it extraordinarily effective at erasing human traces. We should talk about water, because water is the element that connects almost every aspect of this story, and its significance in the Death Valley region is both literal and symbolic in ways that matter. The ancient lake that once filled Death Valley, Lake Manly, was not the only body of water in the region's geological past. The entire Mojave Desert and Great Basin region was dramatically wetter during the Pleistocene, the geological epoch ending roughly 12,000 years ago. Multiple lakes filled the basins of what is now desert. The rivers connecting those lakes carried water across distances that today those landscapes have not seen in millennia. The Amargosa River, which technically still exists but which now flows only rarely and briefly above ground before sinking back into the desert, was once a substantial watercourse carrying the overflow of multiple basin lakes toward the sea. In that wetter world, the Death Valley region was not a death trap. It was a resource-rich environment sitting at the intersection of multiple water systems, a place that would have supported substantial human populations. The animal life would have been diverse and abundant. The plant communities would have been far richer than today's sparse desert flora. The conditions would have been, in every ecological sense, favorable to the development of complex human settlement. The transition from that wetter world to the present arid environment was not instantaneous. It occurred over millennia, gradually enough that populations could adapt to changing conditions, develop strategies for surviving with less water, develop underground architecture as a response to increasing surface temperatures. The oral traditions that speak of people going underground during a time of surface catastrophe may preserve, in mythologized form, memories of that gradual transition, the slow drying that over generations would have transformed a livable surface environment into one that made underground existence not just practical but necessary. The hydraulics of the underground environment in Death Valley are themselves relevant. Where there is water in the subsurface, even in small quantities, cave formation is possible. Where faults have created pathways for water movement, those pathways are potential corridors through the rock. A civilization that understood the underground hydrology of the region, that had mapped the subsurface water movements through generations of observation and experience, would have had a guide to the underground geography that no surface observation could provide. The springs that exist in Death Valley, including the springs at Furnace Creek and at scattered locations around the valley margin, are surfaced expressions of a subsurface water system that extends to considerable depth. The water that reaches the surface at these springs has traveled through the rock for distances and at depths that have not been fully characterized. The pathways it follows are potential pathways for human movement. One of the most frequently cited parallels to the Death Valley Tunnel story in the literature of pre-Columbian American mysteries is the case of the Lovelock Caves in Nevada. The Lovelock Caves, approximately 80 miles northeast of Reno, were excavated beginning in 1912 and produced an extraordinary collection of prehistoric material, including thousands of duck decoys made of tule reed and feathers, mummy bundles, textiles, and basketry representing the most complete assemblage of pre-Columbian material culture ever found in the Great Basin. The Lovelock Cave material dates to roughly 2,000 to 4,000 years before present for most of the deposit, though some materials in the deepest layers are considerably older. The cave had apparently been used as a refuge and storage location by indigenous people over an extraordinarily long period. More relevantly for the present discussion, the Lovelock Cave excavations produced a quantity of human skeletal material. Among that material were a number of individuals of notably large stature, including at least one skull that was substantially larger than the normal range for the region's indigenous populations. These materials, which were described in the excavation reports of the early 20th century, were sent to the University of California at Berkeley and to the Smithsonian. The fate of the anomalous specimens is unclear from the public record. The Lovelock Cave connection to the Death Valley Tunnel story is not documentary. No contemporary account links the two. But the geographical proximity of the Lovelock site to the Death Valley region, the shared pattern of extraordinary preservation in dry cave environments, and the similar trajectory of initial discovery, followed by institutional custody and public inaccessibility, create a thematic parallel that researchers in this area have consistently noted. By the early 1950s, the institutional landscape of American archaeology had been thoroughly reorganized in ways that effectively centralized control over significant discoveries. The Society for American Archaeology, founded in 1934, had developed the infrastructure of professional norms, publication channels, and institutional relationships that defined who was a legitimate researcher and whose findings were worth taking seriously. Amateur researchers, even those with substantial field experience, were increasingly excluded from the processes through which archaeological knowledge was produced and validated. Russell's position, as a medical doctor with amateur interest in the field, would have placed him firmly outside that credentialing system. His reports, however specific and however credible in the eyes of people who heard him describe them, would have had no pathway into the legitimate archaeological record. He could publish in popular venues, he could lecture to civic organizations as Hill did, but he could not publish in peer-reviewed journals, could not present at professional conferences in a capacity that would give his findings institutional recognition, and could not attract the kind of serious follow-up research that documented discoveries in credentialed venues routinely receive. This is not an argument that amateur researchers are always right. They are frequently wrong, often for the predictable reason that field research without institutional support and rigorous methodology produces unreliable results. But the gatekeeping function of credentialing systems works in both directions. It filters out unreliable findings, and it also filters out reliable findings that come from outside the credentialed community. In a field where the most significant discoveries are often made by people without formal training, that second filtering function has a cost that mainstream archaeology has not always been willing to acknowledge. What would it take to settle the Death Valley Tunnel question? The answer is both simple and effectively impossible given current circumstances. It would take a systematic geophysical survey of the valley floor, using ground-penetrating radar and seismic reflection technology, combined with physical investigation of any anomalies the survey detected. The technology for such a survey exists. Ground-penetrating radar has been used successfully in archaeological contexts around the world, including at sites in the Middle East where it has revealed buried structures of considerable significance without any surface indication of their presence. The practical obstacles are substantial. Death Valley National Park requires permits for research activities, and the permitting process is controlled by the National Park Service, which operates under a mandate that includes the management of visitor experience and the protection of cultural resources in ways that tend toward conservatism rather than bold investigation. Military reservations adjacent to the park are simply inaccessible. Private land can be surveyed with the landowner's permission, but identifying the specific private parcels that would be relevant requires knowing approximately where the tunnel system was located, information that is not in the public record. The cost of a serious survey would be substantial, in the range of hundreds of thousands of dollars for equipment, rental, personnel, and field logistics in an extreme environment. That level of funding would require either private investment or institutional support, and institutional support is conditioned on the kind of professional credibility that the Death Valley Tunnel story has never been able to establish through normal channels. The circular nature of this situation is apparent. The evidence that would establish credibility cannot be obtained without funding and access. Funding and access require credibility. Credibility requires evidence. The circle has no obvious entry point. What has been done, in the absence of the systematic survey that would settle the question, is a series of informal and undocumented investigations by individuals who have attempted, over the decades, to locate the tunnel entrance through fieldwork. Some of these individuals have published accounts of their attempts. Most of them have described finding terrain that is consistent with the general descriptions in the 1947 accounts, but not finding a definitive entrance point. The landscape changes over decades. Rockfalls, sand drifts, the slow geological work of weathering and deposition all alter the specific features that a given description might refer to. A narrow defile that served as an entrance marker in 1947 might, 80 years later, be unrecognizable. The connection between the Death Valley Tunnel story and the broader global pattern of underground ancient sites is worth drawing out, because it situates the American case in a context that is harder to dismiss than the American case alone. Underground ancient structures are documented on every inhabited continent. The underground cities of Cappadocia in Turkey, as mentioned earlier, are the most extensively studied example. Derinkuyu, the deepest and most extensive of these cities, descends 11 stories below the surface and is estimated to have housed as many as 20,000 people. It was connected to other underground cities by tunnels that extended for miles through the volcanic rock. It is dated to the Bronze Age at the earliest level, though some researchers have argued that the deepest levels are significantly older. The underground complex at Nars in France, a network of chambers and galleries carved into chalk bedrock, was used during multiple periods of conflict as a refuge site. Similar underground refuge complexes exist in other parts of France, in the chalk country of England, and in areas of the Near East where soft stone made underground construction relatively straightforward. In Peru, the pre-Columbian civilization centered at Cusco constructed an underground tunnel system beneath the city that extended in multiple directions. Some sections of this system have been explored and documented by Peruvian archaeologists. Other sections remain inaccessible or unexplored. Oral traditions in the Cusco area describe the tunnels as extending for distances that the documented sections cannot account for. In India, the Ellora and Ajanta cave complexes demonstrate the capacity of pre-modern cultures to create extensive and sophisticated underground spaces. The Ellora caves, some of which date to the 6th century CE, include a series of underground temples carved from solid rock to a depth and extent that required the removal of thousands of tons of material. The engineering coordination implied by this work is extraordinary. These documented examples from around the world demonstrate that the creation of large-scale underground structures is a well-attested capacity of pre-modern cultures. The assumption that pre-Columbian North Americans could not have built underground structures of significant scale and sophistication is not supported by the global record of what pre-modern cultures have been able to achieve. It is supported only by the specific and incomplete record of what has been found and documented in North America, a record that is itself a product of incomplete and often biased research. The story returns, at its deepest level, to a question about what North America was before the documented record begins. The standard answer, the answer taught in schools and repeated in textbooks, is that North America was a continent of hunting and gathering peoples who gradually developed limited agriculture and modest permanent settlements, eventually producing the cultures we know from the historical contact period, none of which, in the story's telling, approach the level of social complexity and technical achievement seen in the great civilizations of Mesoamerica and South America. That story has always had problems. The earthworks of the eastern woodlands, the great mounds of the Mississippi Valley, the observatory alignments at Cahokia, the trading networks that connected communities from the Gulf Coast to the Great Lakes, all of these represent levels of social organization and cultural sophistication that the simple narrative of pre-Columbian North America cannot easily accommodate. And yet, they exist. They have been documented. They are, in some cases, still visible in the landscape. The archaeology of the American Southwest adds further complications. The canal systems, the cliff dwellings, the astronomical alignments at Chaco Canyon, the extent of the turquoise trading network that connected communities across the region, all of these speak to levels of organized social life that exceed what the standard narrative predicts. And beyond these documented complexities lie the oral traditions, the anomalous petroglyphs, the unexplained archaeological deposits, and the stories like the Death Valley Tunnel story that keep insisting that there is something in the record that the standard narrative has not found room for. The possibility that an ancient, pre-Columbian civilization of significant sophistication left underground traces in the Death Valley region is not, by any serious analysis, inherently more implausible than the documented reality of the Hohokam Canal system, or the ancestral Puebloan trading networks, or the earthwork civilizations of the Mississippi Valley. What makes it feel more implausible is not the quality of the evidence for or against it, but the way the question has been handled by the institutions that control the production of archaeological knowledge. Near the end of his life, if the documentary accounts are to be believed, Howard Hill expressed regret about the public lecture he gave in 1947. Not regret that he had given it, but regret that he had not gone further, had not pushed harder, had not used the moment when the story was briefly in the light to do more than describe it. He reportedly felt that he had contributed to the burial of the story by not being specific enough in his account, by softening the details in ways that made them easier to dismiss. Whether this account of Hill's later views is accurate is not something that can be verified, but the sentiment it expresses is one that runs through many stories of suppressed or ignored archaeological anomalies. The moment when the story is accessible, when the witnesses are present and the evidence is fresh, is always brief. Once that moment passes, the work of reconstruction becomes the work of archaeology itself, sifting through fragments and traces for the shape of something that was once there and is now hidden. The Death Valley tunnels may be sealed, as the title of the story promises, sealed by geology, by time, by deliberate action, by the slow accumulation of desert material over entry points that were once open, sealed by the institutional silence that has surrounded the story for 8 decades, sealed by the loss of the specific knowledge that Russell and his companions had, knowledge that may have passed with them without being fully transmitted. But sealed is not the same as gone. The physical structures, if they exist, are still there. The geology of Death Valley does not uncreate what has been created. The passages that Russell described, the chambers, the smooth walls, the artifacts and remains, if they were real, are still in the ground. The desert has covered them, perhaps. The years have accumulated above them, but they are there. And the questions they raise, about who lived in North America before the documented record begins, about what they built and what they knew and what they left behind, those questions are also still there. Sealed, perhaps, in the sense of being officially closed, but not answered, not resolved, not explained by any framework the current model of American prehistory has produced. The sealed tunnels beneath Death Valley are a mystery that has survived nearly 80 years of official silence, institutional neglect, and the natural processes of a landscape that destroys evidence with magnificent efficiency. They survive because the questions they point toward are not going away. Because the accumulation of anomalous evidence from the American Southwest, from the oral traditions of desert peoples, from the petroglyphs that match no known tradition, from the subsurface structures that geophysical surveys have detected and that no one has chosen to investigate, adds up to something that the absence of a single confirmed discovery cannot neutralize. The sealed tunnels survive because human beings understand, at some level below the reach of the standard narrative, that the history of this continent is longer and stranger and more richly complicated than any institutional framework has yet been willing to fully acknowledge. And the desert keeps its secrets. Patient and ancient, and completely indifferent to the arguments of institutions. The salt flats reflect the desert sun. The mountain walls rise in their ancient colors. Somewhere beneath the valley floor, in the spaces between the geological layers, in the fractured darkness below the world of light and heat, whatever was built and whatever was left there waits, as it has waited since the people who made it went silent, and the story that briefly tried to surface in a hot California summer nearly 80 years ago slipped back beneath the surface of the world that knows and the world that refuses to know. Some truths wait a very long time before anyone is ready to hear them. In Death Valley, the waiting goes on. This is the kind of story I find myself thinking about at night, when the questions that the daylight makes easy to ignore come back with the dark. Where do we actually come from? What did the people before us know that we have forgotten? What is still hidden in the ground beneath the landscapes we walk across without thinking? The landscapes we have named and mapped and classified and, in classifying, convinced ourselves we understand. The Death Valley Tunnel story does not answer those questions. It deepens them. It takes the edge of settled certainty that the standard account of American prehistory tries to maintain and shows it for what it is, not a conclusion, but a position, maintained not by the weight of all the evidence, but by the selective attention of institutions that have their own reasons for preferring certain kinds of answers. If you are still listening, you are the kind of person who lets questions breathe, who does not need every mystery resolved before it becomes interesting, who understands that the most important things about the past are often the things we have not yet been shown. There are tunnels beneath Death Valley. There may be. The evidence that they existed in 1947 is incomplete but not dismissible. The silence that followed their brief emergence into public awareness is more eloquent than any formal denial. The oral traditions that spoke of underground places long before Russell arrived are older than the silence and more persistent. What is down there, if anything, is a question that the desert is keeping for now. But deserts change, climates shift, technologies improve. The ground-penetrating radar that sits in a warehouse somewhere, the geophysical survey that no one has yet funded, the expedition that no institution has yet sanctioned, these things are not impossible in any permanent sense. They are just not yet done. Until they are done, the story breathes in the space between the known and the unknown, between the documented and the merely witnessed, between the history we have been given and the history that the ground still holds. The sealed tunnels are waiting. Whether anyone will unseal them, and whether what is found there will be permitted to change what we think we know, those are questions that belong to the future. For now, they belong to the desert, and to the dark, and to the long, patient silence of things buried too deep for ordinary light to reach. Rest well. The questions will still be there in the morning. There is something that deserves more space in this account, and that is the specific character of the silence from the scientific community in the years after 1947. Because silence from the public, silence from journalists, even silence from government agencies, all of those can be explained by any number of mundane reasons. But the silence from the one community that should have been most agitated by the claims Russell and Hill were making, the archaeological and anthropological academic community, that silence is harder to account for without examining the institutional dynamics of American academia in the post-war period. In 1947, the dominant institutional voice in American archaeology was Harvard University's Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology, which had been the center of the discipline since the 19th century. The Peabody's collections, methodologies, and theoretical frameworks shaped what was considered legitimate archaeological inquiry across the entire American academic system. What the Peabody found interesting was interesting. What the Peabody found unworthy of attention was, for all practical institutional purposes, unworthy of attention. The Peabody's orientation in the post-war period was sharply focused on what we might call the known margins of the official timeline. Its researchers were pushing carefully at the edges of the accepted model, extending the record by hundreds or thousands of years in specific, documentable ways. This was the kind of careful, institutional, professionally safe research that the academic system rewards. It was not the kind of research that welcomes reports from outside the system, claiming that the timeline needs to be extended not by thousands but by tens of thousands of years, and that the evidence for this extension is currently sitting in an underground tunnel in Death Valley that a doctor found. The other major institutional player in American archaeology at the time was the Bureau of American Ethnology, a division of the Smithsonian Institution. The BAE had been producing systematic ethnographic and archaeological reports on Native American cultures since the 1870s. Its researchers had more field experience in the American Southwest than almost anyone outside those communities. They knew the landscape, knew the existing record, and had developed a sophisticated, if incomplete, picture of the pre-Columbian Southwest that had taken decades to assemble. For a BAE researcher in 1947, the Death Valley Tunnel story would have been evaluated against a framework that included everything that had been documented in the Southwest up to that point. The question a BAE researcher would have asked is not whether underground passages were geologically possible in Death Valley, which any geologist could confirm, but whether there was any precedent in the documented archaeological record for the kind of construction and cultural complexity Russell's description implied. The honest answer to that question in 1947 was no, which meant, in the institutional logic of the BAE, that the story was almost certainly wrong. That institutional logic did not involve conspiracy or active suppression. It was simply the natural operation of a system in which prior knowledge defines the framework within which new claims are evaluated. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Russell's evidence was, by any institutional standard, not extraordinary enough. He was an amateur. He had no systematic documentation. He had no peer review. He had no institutional affiliation that would give his account credibility. The BAE's silence was not a decision to suppress a true finding. It was the routine operation of institutional filtering in the direction of the expected. But the practical effect of that routine filtering was exactly the same as deliberate suppression would have been. The story died in the institutional record. And the physical site, the thing that would have settled the question if it could have been found and properly investigated, was never subjected to the systematic examination that might have produced the extraordinary evidence, the extraordinary claim required. The relationship between official scientific institutions and indigenous knowledge in the American Southwest during the post-war period is another thread in this story that deserves examination. Throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the systematic collection of Native American cultural knowledge, including oral traditions, ceremonial practices, and historical accounts, had been conducted by ethnographers who operated under a set of assumptions that fundamentally undermined the epistemic status of what they were collecting. The material was treated as folklore, as mythology, as cultural data interesting for what it revealed about the beliefs and worldview of the people who held it, but not as a source of reliable historical or empirical information. This approach was not simply an academic methodological choice. It was a reflection of the broader cultural hierarchy of the colonial period, in which the knowledge systems of indigenous peoples were evaluated as subordinate to those of Western science. What a Navajo elder said about the history of the land was data about Navajo culture. What a university geologist said about the same land was data about the land itself. The two categories were not comparable because the two kinds of speakers were not considered comparable sources. The practical effect of this hierarchy on the Death Valley Tunnel story is significant. If indigenous oral traditions in the Death Valley region contain knowledge of the tunnel system, as the evidence suggests they do, that knowledge has been categorically unavailable as a source of information for researchers operating within the standard academic framework. It has been filtered out by the methodological assumptions of the field before the question of whether it might be true can even be raised. The reassessment of indigenous oral tradition as a source of genuine historical information has been one of the most significant and under-celebrated developments in the study of the human past over the last several decades. The research demonstrating that Aboriginal Australian traditions preserve accurate information about geological events tens of thousands of years old is only one example. Similar research in other parts of the world has consistently found that oral traditions, when they can be tested against physical evidence, perform significantly better than the old academic dismissals suggested they should. For the Death Valley Tunnel story, this means that the indigenous traditions of the desert Southwest, the Chemehuevi accounts of underground places, the Paiute stories of underground people, the Shoshone descriptions of sealed passages, deserve to be taken seriously not just as cultural data but as potential historical information. They may contain, encoded in the form that oral memory takes, specific details about physical features of the landscape that no amount of geological survey would locate as efficiently as simply asking the people whose ancestors knew those landscapes best. The problem, of course, is that the communities who hold those traditions have had a century of experience with outside researchers who are not interested in what the traditions might record about the physical world, only in what they might reveal about culture and belief. The trust required for those communities to share their deepest geographical knowledge with outside researchers is not something that can be assumed. It has to be built, carefully and over time, and it requires a fundamental shift in the relationship between academic institutions and the communities they have historically treated as objects of study rather than partners in inquiry. There is a particular feature of Death Valley's climate that has implications for underground preservation that most people do not consider. The valley is not simply hot and dry, it is extraordinarily stable in its subsurface conditions. The extreme aridity at the surface means that very little water percolates into the ground. The deep subsurface, below the zone of seasonal temperature variation, maintains a temperature that is lower and more stable than the surface. The combination of low moisture and stable temperature creates an environment that is, from a preservation standpoint, exceptional. Materials placed in a sealed underground chamber in Death Valley would experience conditions as close to ideal preservation as can be found anywhere on Earth. The same conditions that have made the Dead Sea Scrolls, preserved in sealed caves in another extreme desert environment, readable after 2,000 years, would apply with equal or greater force in the sealed chambers beneath the Death Valley Basin. If there are artifacts in those chambers, they are almost certainly intact. The thought is both exciting and melancholy. The idea that a complete material record of a pre-Columbian civilization, preserved in extraordinary detail, might be sitting in the ground beneath one of the most frequently visited national parks in the United States, inaccessible not because it does not exist, but because no one with the resources and the institutional backing has chosen to look for it, is the kind of thought that makes the ordinary frustrations of academic gatekeeping feel genuinely consequential. The scroll analogy is instructive in another way. The Dead Sea Scrolls were found in 1947, the same year as the Death Valley Tunnel story. They were found by a Bedouin shepherd throwing stones into caves above the Qumran shore of the Dead Sea, not by a credentialed archaeologist conducting a systematic survey. The initial response of the academic establishment to reports of ancient documents found by a shepherd in a cave in the Judean desert was, predictably, skeptical. It took years of sustained effort by a small number of researchers who were willing to take the reports seriously, combined with the physical evidence of the scrolls themselves, to bring the discovery into the mainstream. The Death Valley story had no physical artifacts to show. It had accounts, descriptions, the reports of witnesses who may or may not have had the vocabulary to describe accurately what they had seen. Without physical any permit in hand, the story could not cross the threshold that would have compelled the academic establishment to engage with it. And without the academic establishment's engagement, the physical evidence remained in the ground. Consider for a moment the scale of what we are actually talking about when we discuss pre-Columbian North American civilization. North America is a continent of roughly 9.5 million square miles. The portion of that continent that has been systematically surveyed for archaeological sites is a small fraction of the total. The portion that has been excavated to any significant depth is a smaller fraction still. The portion of excavated sites whose material has been fully analyzed and published in the scientific literature is smaller again. We are, in other words, working from an extraordinarily incomplete sample. When archaeologists say that there is no evidence for a given type of civilization or a given level of cultural complexity in pre-Columbian North America, what they mean, more precisely, is that the sites that have been examined, which represent a tiny fraction of the sites that exist, which are themselves a tiny fraction of the total landscape that might contain evidence, have not produced evidence of the type in question. This is not an unusual situation in science. It is the normal situation. Science always works from incomplete samples, but the magnitude of the incompleteness matters. A conclusion drawn from a 1% sample of the available evidence is very different from a conclusion drawn from a 99% sample. The incompleteness of the North American archaeological record is closer to the first than the second. The specific incompleteness relevant to underground sites is worth emphasizing. Archaeological field methods are overwhelmingly oriented toward the surface and the near surface. The standard survey involves walking transects across a landscape, looking for surface indications of cultural activity, scatters of worked stone, soil discolorations, structural remains visible at the surface. These methods are effective for finding what has been deposited on or just below the surface. They are not effective for finding what is substantially below the surface, in geological formations that show no surface expression. An underground structure with no surface expression, no visible entrance, no associated surface scatter, would be systematically missed by every standard archaeological survey method. The only techniques that would find it are geophysical methods specifically designed for deep subsurface investigation, methods that are expensive, time-consuming, and not routinely applied in archaeological survey work. The absence of evidence from standard surveys is therefore genuinely not evidence of absence when it comes to underground structures. The surveys are not capable of detecting what they have not found. Saying that standard archaeological survey of the Death Valley region has not found underground structures is equivalent to saying that a flashlight survey of a dark room has not found what might be behind a closed door. The tool is simply not appropriate to the question. Among the unanswered questions that surround the Death Valley tunnel story, one of the most nagging is the question of water supply. Any civilization constructing and using an underground complex in the Death Valley region would have needed a reliable source of water. The extreme aridity of the present environment makes this seem impossible, but as established earlier in this account, the present environment is not representative of the conditions that have characterized the region across even the relatively recent human timeline. During the period when Lake Manly occupied the valley floor, water would have been readily available at the surface. But as the lake receded, a population that was already established in the region would have needed to find alternative water sources. The springs that currently exist in the valley represent surface expressions of a subsurface water system that extends to considerable depth. That same subsurface water system would have existed during the transition from the wetter Pleistocene to the current arid conditions, and it would have been accessible through wells and underground passages that reach down to the water table. In fact, the subsurface access to water in an increasingly arid surface environment would have been a significant additional motivation for developing underground infrastructure. A civilization that understood its water was underground would have had strong practical reasons to extend its activities underground, to be closer to the water sources its survival depended on. There is one more dimension of this story that has received almost no attention in any of the accounts that have circulated over the decades, and it is perhaps the most unsettling of all. That dimension is the question of what the tunnel builders knew about time. Any civilization capable of constructing underground passages of the scale and quality that Russell described was, by definition, a civilization thinking about the long term. You do not carve smooth walls into bedrock and seal chambers against the desert for the short term. You do not build with the care and precision that the descriptions imply if you expect the structure to be used and abandoned within a single generation. You build that way when you are trying to last, when you are trying to survive something that the surface world cannot survive, when you are constructing something meant to outlast whatever is coming. The oral traditions of the desert peoples speak of catastrophe. They speak of a time when the surface became uninhabitable, when fire came or flood came or darkness came, and the people went underground. The geological record of the region is consistent with periods of dramatic climate transition. The evidence of a large lake filling and then evaporating from the Death Valley Basin over millennia describes exactly the kind of slow catastrophe that a civilization might have seen coming. Decade by decade, generation by generation, the water receding, the temperature rising, the surface becoming less livable, then barely livable, then lethal. A people watching that process unfold over generations would have time to prepare. They would have time to build. They would have time to create, if they had the knowledge and the organization, an underground refuge designed not just for their own lifetimes but for the generations of survivors who would follow them. A place sealed against the heat and the dryness. A place where materials could be preserved, where knowledge could be stored, where the record of what they had been and what they had known could wait out the long catastrophe of the surface becoming uninhabitable. This is not a fantastical interpretation. It is the most straightforward reading of all the evidence taken together. A civilization in a landscape undergoing catastrophic climate change, with sufficient knowledge and organization to build substantial underground infrastructure, choosing to preserve what it could of its culture and knowledge in a sealed underground environment. That is not myth. That is rational response to a situation that the people living through it would have understood very well. The question of what is in those chambers, if they exist, is therefore not merely an archaeological question. It is a question about what knowledge a civilization that understood the Death Valley landscape, as well as its builders apparently did, would have considered worth preserving. What did they know about the land, about the climate, about the underground water system, about the plants and animals and geological processes of the region that they thought important enough to seal away against the future? A body of knowledge like that, preserved intact for 10,000 or 15,000 years, in an environment that the desert has maintained at perfect preservation conditions, would be the most significant intellectual inheritance the present world had ever received from the past. It would not just fill gaps in the academic record of pre-Columbian North America, it would reframe the entire question of what knowledge is and how it survives, and what we owe to the people who built systems for its preservation when the world they knew was ending. There are researchers working today, quietly and outside the institutional mainstream, who are building the case for a pre-Columbian North American civilization more complex and more ancient than the standard model allows. They are not conspiracy theorists or sensationalists. They are people who have looked at the full body of evidence with rigorous methods and found that the evidence does not support the conclusions that the field has drawn from it. They publish in journals that the mainstream does not read, present at conferences that the credentialing system does not recognize, and build bodies of work that accumulate in the spaces between the official records. Some of this work touches directly on the Death Valley region. Researchers examining the distribution patterns of specific artifact types across the Mojave and Great Basin have found connections to materials from other parts of the world that the standard model of pre-Columbian isolation cannot account for. Researchers studying the astronomical orientations of surviving surface features in the Death Valley area have found alignments that seem deliberate and that match celestial events in ways that require a sophisticated observational knowledge to produce. None of this work is conclusive. It is fragmentary, suggestive, pointing in directions that the resources required to follow them fully have never been assembled, but it keeps pointing in the same direction, toward a human presence in the Death Valley region that is older, more organized, and more technically accomplished than the accepted narrative allows. Toward a past that the ground is still holding, sealed away from the surface and from the official record, waiting for someone to unseal it with enough care and enough seriousness to hear what it has to say. The researchers working on these questions share a particular quality of patience. They have learned that the institutional resistance to their findings is not going to dissolve on a particular day. They have learned that the evidence they are accumulating will not produce the dramatic moment of recognition they might have once hoped for. The press conference, the journal article, the revision of the textbooks. They work because the questions are real and because real questions deserve real attention, regardless of whether the recognition arrives in their own lifetimes. That kind of patience is itself a form of tribute to whoever built the tunnels, if they were built. A people who sealed their knowledge and their materials underground against a catastrophe that would outlast them by millennia were practicing the ultimate form of long-term thinking. The researchers who continue to work on the questions their legacy raises are practicing a smaller version of the same thing, doing the work, trusting that the work will find its moment. Knowing that the desert is patient and that whatever it holds without urgency, without deadline, without the human anxiety about whether the answer will arrive in time. And maybe that is the most honest place to leave this. Not with a conclusion, not with a verdict, but with the simple acknowledgement that the ground beneath Death Valley has not been fully asked what it holds. The questions that were briefly raised in the summer of 1947 and then quietly buried deserve the same careful excavation we would give to anything else that matters. The desert is not finished with this story. Neither are we. The sealed tunnels are waiting, in the dark beneath the valley floor, patient as stone, patient as the long, unfinished story of what this continent was before anyone whose name we know walked across its surface. The desert keeps its secrets. Sleep well,